You can wait outside." The words hung in the air at the entrance of the ballroom, light but unmistakable. Conversations continued behind me. Glasses clinked. Soft music played. No one rushed to correct her. I tightened my grip around the folder in my hands. Inside were 8 months of system specifications, automation protocols, and defense contract documentation. Work that had quietly stabilized Phoenix Technologies after their near-catastrophic failure on the Falcon project. Work that had never once been mentioned publicly. "Excuse me?" I asked, my voice barely rising above the background chatter. Diana Brooks, the company's operations director, glanced at me with polite impatience. "We're at capacity for the ceremony," she said. "This event is reserved seating." I looked past her into the room. Everyone from my department was already inside. Every engineer, every project manager, even Heath Morrison, the junior hire who had joined less than a month ago, sat at a round table near the front, adjusting his tie nervously. I recognized my own system diagrams reflected on the screensaver behind the stage. "I didn't realize I wasn't included," I said. Diana smiled thinly. "Brady, you're a technical contributor. Tonight is for leadership and award recipients. Why would we use a seat on you?" That sentence landed heavier than the first. I followed her gaze to the large projection screen at the front of the room. Defense Innovation Excellence Award. The automated manufacturing system being honored was mine. Every algorithm, every safety protocol, every efficiency optimization. "I understand," I said quietly. I set my folder down on a nearby table, opened my laptop, and typed a single line. "Please check your email." Within seconds, notification chimes began echoing across the ballroom. One phone, then another. A pause in conversation, then murmurs. I closed my laptop and walked away. "My name is Brady Sullivan. I'm 47 years old. At the time, I was the senior systems engineer at Phoenix Technologies, one of the fastest-growing defense contractors in the region. I had a reputation for precision and for staying out of internal politics. I believed problems mattered more than credit. I grew up believing good work eventually spoke for itself. What I didn't understand, at least not then, was how carefully some people controlled who was allowed to speak and who was expected to wait outside. That night was the moment everything finally became clear. I didn't always understand that I was being erased. At first it felt subtle, almost accidental. A technical presentation delivered without my name. A project summary that mentioned the engineering team instead of the person who designed the core systems. Small things, easy to excuse if you wanted to believe the system was fair. When I joined Phoenix Technologies, I believed it was. I came in straight from my military service, hired for my ability to untangle complex automation systems and find efficiency where others saw chaos. Within my first year, I rebuilt a production line control system that increased output by 42%. I redesigned their quality assurance protocols that prevented 3 major safety violations. None of it was flashy. All of it worked. People noticed, just not publicly. My manager at the time, Lance Cooper, had a reputation for polishing ideas before they reached executives. I thought that meant refinement. What it actually meant was ownership. The first time he presented my work without acknowledging me, I assumed it was a misunderstanding. I corrected him afterward casually. Lance smiled. "Relax, Brady. Leadership doesn't care who builds it. They care that it works." That sentence followed me for months. Every major breakthrough followed the same pattern. I would identify a flaw, design a fix, document everything, and send it up the chain. Weeks later, the solution would reappear in a leadership meeting, rebranded, renamed, and credited elsewhere. Promotions followed, raises followed, just not to me. When I finally brought it up with human resources, the response was polite and empty. They asked whether the work was done during office hours, whether I had used company systems, whether I could prove exclusive authorship beyond timestamps. The implication was clear. If the company benefited, the company decided who received recognition. I learned to stay quiet. What they didn't see was how closely I observed everything after that. I kept original files on personal drives. I documented version histories. I saved meeting invitations, approval emails, and presentation drafts. I noticed how often the same names appeared next to ideas that didn't originate with them. 8 months before the awards ceremony, I started working on something new. But this time, I told no one. I used my own equipment, my own time, my own resources. I took the frameworks they had watered down and rebuilt them properly, correcting the weaknesses they never understood. I wasn't planning revenge. I was preparing for independence. By the time the company announced the Defense Innovation Excellence Award nominees, I already knew two things. First, my work would be celebrated under someone else's name. And second, they had no idea how much of their success still depended on me staying silent. The ceremony wasn't the beginning of the end. It was simply the moment they made me stop waiting. Once I stopped trying to be seen, everything became easier to understand. When you're hoping for recognition, you second-guess yourself. You soften your conclusions. You assume good faith. But when you accept that credit is never coming, clarity follows. I began to see Phoenix Technologies not as a collection of individuals, but as a system. One that extracted ideas upward and quietly replaced the people who generated them. Lance wasn't the exception. He was the mechanism. He encouraged initiative, but only in private. He praised innovation, but only when it could be reframed as departmental progress. He spoke, often about collaboration. Yet every executive presentation had a single voice, his. Over time, others learned the rules. Engineers stopped sharing raw ideas. Project managers focused on optics instead of outcomes. Meetings became performances rather than problem-solving sessions. And the company slowly began relying on a shrinking group of people who still did the actual work. People like me. I started paying attention to who had left. There was Clay Bennett from infrastructure, whose automation process cut maintenance costs in half before being absorbed into a leadership initiative. He resigned quietly 6 months later. Brett Wallace from compliance, who built a risk assessment model that prevented a regulatory fine, only to watch it be introduced as a VP's strategic insight. He took a job elsewhere within weeks. I reached out to them under the pretense of catching up. What I found was consistency. Same patterns, same explanations, same exhaustion. Each of them had walked away not because they lacked opportunity, but because they recognized a ceiling that had nothing to do with ability. Those conversations changed how I approached my own work. I stopped submitting complete solutions internally. I shared fragments, enough to keep systems running, not enough to replace me. I began isolating the most critical components of my analysis, dependencies no one else fully understood, and quietly maintained them myself. No one noticed. Why would they? Things still worked. At the same time, I continued developing my independent framework. What started as an exercise in control became something larger. I realized that many of Phoenix's biggest clients were compensating for the company's internal limitations on their own end, building workarounds, absorbing inefficiencies, tolerating delays because switching providers felt risky. I knew how to fix those problems. More importantly, I knew how much those clients were losing by staying silent. During my 21 years at Phoenix Technologies, I'd learned something valuable. The company's success wasn't built on brilliant leadership or cutting-edge innovation. It was built on a handful of people who understood how to make complex systems actually work. People who stayed quiet, fixed problems behind the scenes, and let others take the credit. That model works fine until those people stop playing along. By the time the awards ceremony approached, I had already spoken carefully, discreetly, with several former colleagues and 2 external advisors. Not about rebellion, about possibility, about what could exist if the people who actually understood the systems were allowed to build without distortion. The email I sent that night wasn't emotional. It wasn't dramatic. It was precise. And it was only the first move. People assumed the email was an outburst. They imagined a long message, emotional language, accusations typed in anger. That assumption was useful. It kept them from understanding how long the email had been waiting. It was short. No adjectives, no threats, no appeals. The subject line read, "Notice of material change." Inside were 4 attachments. The first was a formal resignation letter. Mine. Clean, immediate, effective at the end of the business day. It cited no grievances, only a transition clause buried deep in my original contract, one that allowed immediate departure if project scope changed without disclosure. The second attachment contained 8 more resignation letters. Not copies, originals. Each from a senior contributor Phoenix depended on far more than leadership realized. Infrastructure, compliance, client systems, people who had already secured their next steps, quietly, months earlier. The third attachment was a technical summary, not my full framework, just enough to demonstrate where it came from. Time-stamped models, version histories, independent development logs. Anyone with basic technical knowledge could see the difference between company-owned systems and the architecture I had built privately. The fourth attachment was the most important: client notifications. 4 of them. Each informed a key defense contractor that I was departing Phoenix Technologies and launching an independent venture. The language was careful: no solicitation, no persuasion, just disclosure. Each letter ended the same way: if you have questions about continuity or alternative solutions, I'm available to speak. That was it. No commentary, no signature flourish, just facts. I sent the email to the executive distribution list, legal, human resources, and the board liaison address. Then I powered down my laptop and walked toward the elevator as the ceremony dissolved behind me. By the time I reached the lobby, my phone was already vibrating. I didn't answer it. I stepped outside into the cool night air and waited for the second wave, the realization phase. That was when people stopped reacting and started calculating. They had assumed I was replaceable. They had assumed the systems would continue functioning because they always had. What they didn't realize was how many of those systems were balanced on knowledge that lived nowhere except inside a few people's heads. Knowledge I had carefully protected, not out of malice, but out of habit. I had never designed my work to be dramatic. I designed it to be correct. The first call came before I reached my car. I didn't look at the screen. I already knew who it would be. When something breaks quietly, leadership waits. When it breaks structurally, they panic. By the time I drove out of the parking structure, my phone was lighting up in steady intervals. Missed calls, unread messages, calendar invites marked urgent. I turned the volume off and focused on the road. I needed them to feel the gap before they tried to fill it. What happened inside Phoenix after I left wasn't chaos. Not yet. At first it was confusion. The ceremony resumed awkwardly. The award was still announced. Applause happened a half-second too late. Smiles didn't quite hold. Then the legal department opened the attachments. That's when the tone changed. Resignations triggered review protocols. Client disclosures triggered risk assessments. The technical summary triggered something more dangerous: recognition. Anyone who looked at it could see the truth immediately. The company's most celebrated innovation rested on an incomplete understanding of its own systems, and the person who fully understood them had just walked away. An hour later, my phone vibrated again. This time, a message slipped through from Lance Cooper. "Let's talk. This doesn't have to escalate." That line would have worked 8 months earlier. I didn't respond. What Lance and the others didn't know was that I had already spoken to an employment attorney twice. We had reviewed my contract, my documentation, my development logs. Every step had been measured against risk, not emotion. I wasn't burning a bridge, I was stepping off it. Around 10 that night, I finally checked my voicemail. There were 14 messages. The shortest one mattered most. It came from the office of the Chief Operating Officer, Kelly Anderson. "Brady, this is Kelly. We need clarity, immediately. Clarity." That was the word they used when they wanted control back. I waited until the next morning to respond. Not with a call, but with an email. 1 paragraph, professional, direct. I confirmed my resignation. I confirmed the independence of my work. I confirmed my availability for transitional questions related strictly to documentation already owned by the company, nothing more. Within minutes, the requests changed. Meetings were proposed. Titles were implied. One message referenced correcting an oversight. Another suggested realigning recognition structures. I read them without reaction because the moment they decided I mattered wasn't the moment I needed them anymore. What they hadn't yet realized was that my departure wasn't the crisis. The timing was. Clients had already started asking questions, not accusations, questions about continuity, about performance guarantees, about whether the systems they depended on were as stable as they believed. Those conversations hadn't reached leadership yet, but they would. And when they did, Phoenix would understand something it had avoided for years. Talent doesn't announce its exit loudly. It simply stops holding everything together. I never called the clients first. That detail mattered from Phoenix's perspective. The risk wasn't that I was leaving. It was that I might persuade others to leave with me. That assumption guided every internal response they made in the next 48 hours. Legal reviewed non-compete clauses. Sales drafted contingency language. Leadership prepared a narrative. They were all solving the wrong problem. The clients didn't need persuasion. They needed reassurance. And they weren't calling because I invited them to. They were calling because systems don't lie. Within a day of my resignation, response. Time slowed. Minor anomalies appeared in monitoring dashboards. Nothing catastrophic, just enough friction to trigger internal alerts on the client side. Engineers at those companies began tracing issues upstream. They always led back to the same place, me. By late afternoon, I had 3 voicemails from client technical leads. Not salespeople, not executives, the people who actually monitored performance. They didn't ask where I was going, they asked whether I was still available. I returned each call carefully. I explained that I was no longer with Phoenix. I confirmed that I had no authority over their current contracts. I answered questions about documentation they already possessed and clarified what I could without crossing any lines. I offered nothing, and still the implications were obvious. That evening, an unfamiliar number appeared on my screen. I answered it. "Brady," a man said after a pause. "This is Dean Phillips. I oversee defense integration at Summit Logistics. Summit was Phoenix's largest client." "I understand," he continued, "that you're no longer with Phoenix. We've been told everything is stable, but my team insists the automation architecture depends on decisions only you fully understand." I let the silence stretch. "We're not looking to breach anything," Dean added. "We just need to know what options exist if continuity becomes an issue." That was the question. Not will you help us, but what exists beyond this? I told him the truth, that I was building something independent, that it was not yet operational, that when it was, it would not be a replica of Phoenix's system, but a cleaner framework designed to eliminate the compromises that caused these dependencies in the first place. He didn't interrupt. At the end of the call, he said, "Keep us informed. Not good luck. Not we'll see. Keep us informed." By the end of the week, similar conversations had happened with 3 other firms, all initiated by them, all documented by me, all handled without promises. Inside Phoenix, panic was hardening into urgency. They offered me a retention bonus, then a title, then equity language that hadn't existed before. Lance sent a message that tried to sound human. "You didn't have to do it like this. He was wrong. This was the only way it could have happened. Because if I had warned them, if I had negotiated, they would have delayed, diluted, redirected. They always had. By not calling first, I forced the truth to surface on its own, and once it did, there was no containing it." The meeting request arrived on a Friday morning. No subject line, just a calendar block sent from the executive office. Marked mandatory, scheduled for early afternoon, no agenda, no dial-in link, in person only. That was new. I accepted without comment. When I arrived at Phoenix's headquarters, the building felt different, quieter. Conversations stopped when I passed. People avoided eye contact, not out of hostility but calculation. Word had spread faster than leadership expected. The conference room was already full. Lance sat near the far end of the table, hands folded too tightly. Kelly Anderson, the COO, was there along with 2 senior legal counsel and someone I hadn't met before. A man in a neutral suit who didn't introduce himself. Board representation, most likely. Kelly gestured to an empty chair. "Thank you for coming, Brady." I sat. She didn't waste time. "We underestimated your role." That admission would have meant something once. Now it sounded procedural. Kelly continued. "Your resignation created exposure we did not anticipate. Client confidence is unsettled." The lawyer slid a folder across the table. Inside were printed copies of my documentation, the same files I had attached to the email. They had been reviewed carefully now, annotated, highlighted. "We'd like to discuss options," Kelly said. "Retention, revised scope, direct reporting." Lance finally spoke. "We can correct the record." Correct the record. I looked at him. Publicly? He hesitated. That was the answer. The board representative leaned forward. "Brady, what you built is valuable, but value doesn't have to come at the cost of alignment." I met his gaze. "Alignment with what?" "With the structure," he said finally. That was the core of it. They weren't afraid of losing me. They were afraid of losing the structure that allowed ideas to be absorbed without accountability. Kelly exhaled slowly. "What would it take for you to stay?" I didn't answer immediately. Not to be dramatic, but because I wanted to be accurate. "I won't," I said at last, "but I will be clear." They listened now. I didn't leave because of compensation. I left because the system here treats contribution as raw material and recognition as a privilege. You can adjust titles, you can adjust reporting lines, but you don't intend to change that system. Kelly didn't deny it. What happens next, I continued, is up to you. I'm not soliciting your clients. I'm not attacking your company. I'm simply no longer preventing the consequences of decisions you've been insulated from. The board representative closed his folder. You understand this will escalate? Yes, I said. That's why I prepared. I stood, nodded once, and left. Behind me, no one tried to stop me this time. They finally understood something had shifted. Not the balance of power, the direction of it. The shift didn't happen all at once. From the outside, Phoenix still looked stable. Press releases went out as scheduled. Leadership posted carefully worded updates about ongoing innovation and strong client partnerships. Anyone glancing at the surface would have assumed nothing had changed. Inside, it was different. Small failures began appearing in places no one could spin. A data sync issue delayed a regional rollout by 6 hours. A forecasting discrepancy forced a client to manually override automated systems. Nothing dramatic, but enough to trigger internal reviews. Those reviews led to uncomfortable questions. Why did so many processes rely on undocumented assumptions? Why were key dependencies maintained by a single contributor? Why had no one else been trained to manage them? The answers were buried in years of shortcuts. Shortcuts taken because things had always worked, because someone, me, had been there to quietly stabilize the edges. Without that buffer, the system revealed its shape. I heard about the first internal escalation through a former colleague. She messaged me late one night, careful with her wording. They're scrambling, she wrote. Not because things broke, because they finally see how close they always were. Phoenix's leadership responded the only way they knew how, by assigning blame downward. Task forces were created. Emergency audits launched. Lance was removed from 2 projects pending review. None of it addressed the actual problem. Meanwhile, client conversations continued. Calm, professional, inevitable. Technical teams compared notes. Patterns emerged. When they asked Phoenix for explanations, they received reassurances instead of answers. That was when the calls changed tone. One client asked whether knowledge transfer plans existed beyond documented procedures. Another requested a third-party review of system architecture. A third asked a single dangerous question: who designed this, and where are they now? Phoenix couldn't answer honestly. By the time their legal team reached out to me again, this time with a different posture, I already knew what they would say. They wanted time to stabilize, time to negotiate, time to contain the spread. I didn't give it to them. Not by refusing, by remaining still. I continued working quietly on my own venture, refining the framework, testing it with advisors, preparing documentation that assumed transparency instead of hierarchy. What Phoenix never understood was that the real damage wasn't operational, it was psychological. Once people inside the company realized that leadership didn't actually understand the systems they claimed to control, confidence eroded quickly. Decisions slowed, approval stalled, initiative dried up. No one wanted to be responsible for the next invisible dependency. By the end of the month, Phoenix hadn't collapsed, but it had lost momentum. And momentum, once gone, is almost impossible to fake. 1 year after the awards ceremony, I walked into a different conference room. This one didn't belong to Phoenix. It was an industry summit hosted by an independent consortium. Engineers, operators, and decision-makers who cared less about titles and more about systems that actually worked. I hadn't asked to be on the program. I had been invited. As I stood near the podium, waiting for my turn to speak, I thought briefly about the night I'd been told to wait outside, about how small that moment had felt at the time, and how large it had become in hindsight. Phoenix still existed. It hadn't collapsed. Companies like that rarely do, but it had changed shape. Several executives had quietly moved on. Defense contracts had thinned. Innovation announcements sounded cautious now, layered with disclaimers. My venture had grown differently. Slowly, intentionally. We didn't scale by absorbing people. We scaled by clarity. Every system we built could be explained by more than one person. Every decision had a name attached to it, not for blame, but for ownership. Clients noticed, not because we marketed harder, but because they no longer had to guess who understood their systems. There was no theater, no translation layer, just direct conversations with the people who designed what they depended on. When I finally stepped onto the stage, I didn't tell my story the way people expected. I didn't name Phoenix. I didn't describe the ceremony. I didn't mention the email. Instead, I spoke about structural risk, about how organizations fail not when they lose talent, but when they mistake silence for stability, about how systems built on uncredited labor eventually forget how they function. At the end, I said something simple. The most dangerous assumption any company can make is that the people holding things together will always stay quiet. There was no applause at first. Then there was. Afterward, several people approached me, some to ask technical questions, some to share stories they hadn't told anyone before, others just to say they recognized the pattern. As I left the venue, my phone buzzed once more. A message from an unfamiliar number. Phoenix is restructuring again. They finally understand what they lost. I read it, then locked my phone. Understanding arrives late for some systems. Too late to recover what mattered. I didn't feel satisfaction or bitterness or triumph. What I felt was steadiness. I no longer needed a seat they controlled. I had built a structure that didn't require permission to exist, and that, I realized, was the real ending. I used to believe that if I stayed quiet and worked harder, things would eventually become fair. This experience taught me something different. Value doesn't grow in silence. It grows when you choose where to stand.